How's it going, people? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video in my 1997 Mazda MX-5. One of the most characterful cars I have ever owned. Well, I mean, I've only owned 4 cars so far, and of those 4, I'd say maybe it's the second most, probably the second most characterful. And I mentioned it from 1997, and I've recently heard a lot of people saying that new cars don't have character. So if you buy a brand new car or a car from the last sort of 5 or 6 years or whatever, it lacks the character of older cars like this. And that really made me think, what actually is character in terms of a car? Is it really the case that only old cars can have character, or can new cars also have a whole bunch of character to themselves as well? Remember to hit the like button if you enjoy it, subscribe as well if you're new, but without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, before we begin, one of the key reasons why this topic has come up in my brain ever so recently is because on the weekend I went and I drove 4 Ferraris around the Top Gear test track. I drove a 458, I drove a California, I drove a 348, and I drove a 360 Modena. Really great experience. It was a birthday present from my girlfriend, all good and well. And to be perfectly honest, I am the kind of person that loves older cars. I was really looking forward to getting a chance to drive the 348 and the 360 in particular, but on the day, I actually far preferred the 458 and the California, which I feel like is heresy based on my channel, because I went from 2 gated manual cars to 2 cars with automatic boxes using the paddle shift. And I'll finish that story in a sec. Gotta put some petrol in the car. So yes, as I was saying, I drove these 4 Ferraris on the weekend, and yeah, I honestly thought that I was going to absolutely adore driving the 360 and the 348. I was thinking it was going to have that great old car smell. It was going to feel really visceral with the changing gears in a gated manual box. The sound was going to be better because there was less regulations to make the sound worse, basically. And ultimately, all in, it was just going to be a better experience. But then, yes, as I said on the day, I got in the 458, I got in the California, and I really did not expect to like the California. I thought it was going to be a bit boring. It wasn't like mind-bogglingly amazing, but it was very nice to drive. And I would almost say there was more to it than the other 2 cars, if that makes any sense. And now that's not to say that 360s and 348s have less character than either of those 2 cars. That's not what I'm saying at all. Instead, what I'm saying is that the 360 and the 348 were really badly looked after by the company that was letting us drive them. Not badly looked after, that's an unfair way of putting it, but they were dogs. Sheds, hoopties, whatever you want to call them. They weren't good examples. And that kind of brings me on to my first point about character. Before we even get into kind of defining it, one thing that I want to get out of the way nice and quickly is that character does not mean bad, as in a car that shouldn't be breaks down all the time, or has a really horrible crunch into 3rd gear that just is agonizing every time you do it, as was the case with the 360. And it doesn't do anything else dangerous that could like put your life at risk or anything like that. My definition of character in a car is that it has its own kind of personality. There's a way you need to drive it. There's a way you need to do certain things, like maybe one of the windscreen wipers just doesn't go quite at the right rate as the other one. Maybe one of the windows rolls down slowly or makes a noise whilst it does it. Maybe you have to jiggle one of the locks or something in order to get the door to open or something like that. I'm talking about little things that could be considered annoying, but instead they're just kind of stuff that you live with as an owner of the car, and they kind of tell a story of the car's past and the car's history and that kind of stuff. My Skoda, for example, had a whole bunch of those features, which is why I say it. And I think that car was probably the most characterful car that I had. Every little bump, every little dink, every little thing that was on the car told the story of that Skoda, both for the owners before myself and for me as an owner. Hang on 1 second. There was a little scrape on the back left where some girl had driven into the back of me in her Fiat 500, for example. The passenger door sometimes opened and sometimes it didn't, with literally no logic behind it. There was no logic to make it open or not open. It had a cat delete because the cat broke, so the car actually sounded reasonably cool and it ran really free on air. I used to say it had 50 different shades of green on it because honestly the paint was inconsistent across the entire car, but not like from panel to panel, just the whole car was ombre green. And all of those little things made character in that car. And so what all of those things tell you is that in the time that car had been owned, it gained character. None of what I've said is about how the car actually drove, because the driving part wasn't important for the car's character. Let's talk about this car instead. This car I'd say has bags of character. I mean, you can hear the character in the first place, those pops and bangs out the back, so it needs to be remapped. The whine from the supercharger, which makes it different to pretty much every other car on the road. People look at it like, what is going on with that car? The way I simply cannot drive it in wet weather with the roof up, because if I do, the whole car steams up on the interior. The little shudder that comes from that side of the car that I still cannot work out what it actually is. However, this car is slightly different because it's focused on performance. There are some characterful features in the way that it is driven or the way that it drives. The handling is utterly mesmerizing because of all the modifications we've done to it, but in a way that kind of makes it seem almost a bit ridiculous. The car just handles too well for its own good. It does bump around a bit. It's not a particularly comfortable car, but those kind of shudders and jolts and whatever remind you that you're in a race car, you're in a track car. The back doesn't like to step out in dry weather, but as soon as it gets wet, suddenly it's all over the place. The back wants to go anywhere that you don't want it to go. And of course, every time you put your foot down, it feels like the world is about to collapse in on itself. And so yes, the car has loads of character. It's old, it's got loads of little quirks and features to copy our friend Doug. It drives in a certain way and wants to be driven in a certain way that makes it an interesting car and makes it have a personality. However, and it's a big however, I would argue that many new cars or newer cars do also have a lot of character. And I'm coming from the perspective of someone who much prefers older cars. When I drove that BMW M4 recently, it was from, well, it's 2015 plate, but actually a 2016 model. It wants to be driven in a very certain way. It really didn't grip up in the same way as I thought like a modern car should. It drove in a little bit awkwardly. It had maybe a bit too much weight. The back wanted to come round every so often, or it wanted to step round. And that kind of made it an interesting thing to drive. It gave the car a bit of personality, even though it had a flappy pedal box as well. When I drove that 4C last year, I would contend there are very few cars that have anywhere near as much character as that car. Everything you do, it felt like you were doing it because it didn't have any power steering. You didn't know if the back was going to step out or if you were going to understeer. The car felt almost too cheaply designed for its own good, whilst at the same time being too expensively designed for its own good. Why does it have a carbon fiber tray down here or chassis down here when up here it's all plastic? There was plenty of character in that car. And in the 458 to drive, the sound was incredible, the brakes were really strong, but the back wanted to come round. The interior I thought was maybe less good than it really should be. Then I would argue that at least in the way that those cars drive, they do have character. Now, they may not have the other little quirks that you might require in order to have a car with bags of character, like this car, like the Skoda, like the Polo, but that's kind of unfair. If the argument for cars having character is that they have to be old, then yes, every used car will have more character than a new car. If character is dependent on age, then older cars will have even more character and newer cars will have even less character. But if character is based not only on age, but also on the way that they drive, on the things that they do, on the sound that they make, all that kind of stuff, then I would argue that plenty of newer and new cars do have their own character. They just haven't got a story to tell yet. So going back to my original point around the 348 and the 360 versus the 458 and the California, which are many years apart between them, the way the 458 and the California drove, I'm not just talking about like the more luxury idea of driving a modern car and it has just better features for you to drive, but they were actually really fun to drive. And they had a lot of things going for them that made them interesting and made them a kind of thing that a car enthusiast would want to own and would want to drive, and they had character behind that. So my final thoughts then, as someone who loves older cars, let's not shun new cars for not having any character. Let's appreciate them for the character that they have when they leave the factory, i.e. in the way that they drive, in the special features that they bring, in the stories that they may be able to tell in the future, and appreciate the fact that in the future there will be plenty of old second-hand examples that will have a massive story to tell, and we'll all be talking about how much character those new cars have when they are old, if that makes any sense. Just remember, particularly with cheap cars, at one point someone thought that my 2002 Polo had no character when it left the factory. It was just another cheap car with uninteresting handling and uninteresting features about it that just was there to fill a gap in the market for VW. And now it would be automatically accepted as having loads of character just by the virtue of age. I don't know, love to know what you guys think. By the way, had a great time driving those 4 Ferraris of the day, all 4 of them, whether they were dogs or not. And I'm not saying, by the way, that they are dogs generally. I would love to own a 348, I'd love to own a 360. I would just take more care of them than what that company does with theirs. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to hit the like button, subscribe as well if you're new. Let me know in the comments your thoughts. But as always, massive thank you to the patrons and to you guys as well for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Listen.